Do you believe that a simple sandwich and a handwritten note can change someone's entire life? This story isn't just about kindness. It's living proof that even the smallest acts can have the biggest impact. This is an extraordinary 10-year journey between a quiet cook and a homeless boy until one fateful day changed everything. They let her go after 17 years. No farewell party. No thank you speech. Not even a polite handshake. Just a folded letter, typed in cold, handed to her by a junior manager who couldn't meet her eyes. Your role is no longer aligned with the company's future vision. It had read. Grace had stood there in the back hallway of the restaurant, beneath the flickering fluorescent light, too stunned to speak. Around her, the clatter of dishes, the sizzle of frying pans, and the low murmur of kitchen chatter continued as if nothing had changed. But for her, everything had. That day, she walked out quietly, her hands clutching a worn cardboard box filled with few personal items, an old ceramic mug, her recipe notebook with frayed edges, and the faded apron she had worn every single day for almost 2 decades. She didn't cry. Not then. Not until the sky itself broke open and rain started to fall in long, slanting sheets. As she stepped outside, the cold wind hit her like a wave, and the box became damp in her arms. Still, she didn't run for cover. She stood on the sidewalk, unmoving, as if the world had stopped spinning. The cardboard sagged under the weight of the rain and memory. A lifetime of quiet work had been dismissed in a single moment, and no one, not the manager, not the staff, not even the owner, had said her name. Months passed. Life moved on. Grace found a quiet job at a small grocery store just a few blocks away. She stocked shelves and smiled gently at customers, always polite, always invisible. She never told anyone about the restaurant, never spoke of the years she poured into its kitchen, into every simmering pot and carefully folded napkin. She lived alone in a modest apartment with creaky floors and a kettle that whistled too loudly. There were no photos on the walls, no voices filling the space. Just silence, routine, and a quiet ache that no one saw. Then one morning, in the middle of her shift, she found something strange in her mailbox at home, an envelope, thick and cream-colored, sealed with wax. Her name was written in elegant script across the front, Grace Hamilton. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. You are cordially invited to the grand reopening of the restaurant formerly known as Rosemary's Table. We will be honored by your presence. Grace's hands trembled as she held the invitation. There was no sender listed, no return address, just a date, a time, and those strangely formal words. Cordially invited. No one had spoken to her with that kind of respect in years. She considered throwing away, thinking it must be some mistake. Why would they invite her back? But something deep inside, a quiet pulse of curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of hope, told her to go. She didn't dress up. Just her usual coat, a scarf someone had knitted for her years ago, and the same leather shoes she wore to work. She didn't expect anything, certainly not a warm welcome. Maybe she would just walk past the building, look at it one last time, then keep going. She didn't owe anyone anything. And yet that morning, she found herself standing at the corner where the restaurant used to sit, a place that had once been her world. But it wasn't the same. The old red awning was gone. In its place, a new sign gleamed above the entrance in bold white letters against dark wood. Grace's Table, where every child has a seat. She blinked. No, that couldn't be right. Her heart skipped, then stuttered. Her knees felt strangely unsteady. She took a slow step back, as if trying to understand what she was seeing. Her name was on the sign. Big, permanent, proud. She glanced around, half expecting someone to laugh, to tell her it was a mistake, a prank. But there was no one. Just then, the door opened, and a young staff member stepped out, a girl no older than 20, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Are you Grace?" the girl asked. Grace hesitated, unsure whether to nod or run. Her voice caught in her throat. "Please," the girl said, "come in. Everyone's waiting for you." Inside, the restaurant had changed. It was brighter, warmer. The walls were painted a soft yellow. The air smelled not just of food, but of something more intangible, gratitude, perhaps Yet it wasn't the decor that struck Grace most. It was the way people looked at her. Customers paused their meals. Staff members stood a little straighter. Conversations softened. No one stared, but everyone watched with something like reverence, as if she were someone important. Grace walked slowly, almost dazed. Her fingers gripped the strap of her purse tightly, as if to anchor herself. She could feel her cheeks warming under the weight of so many eyes. She had spent her life being overlooked, walking through crowded rooms like a shadow. But here now she felt seen. The room fell silent. A hush rolled across the floor like a quiet wind. Then, from down the street came the soft rumble of engines. 5 black Rolls-Royces pulled up the curb in a slow, almost ceremonial procession. People turned to look. The door of the first car opened, and out stepped an older man, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a gray suit. He walked with quiet authority, but his eyes were gentle. They locked onto Grace's, and in that moment, something shifted. He approached her slowly, deliberately. His hands were clasped together in front of him, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, so soft it barely carried across the room. "Are you the woman who gave a little boy food every day for 10 years?" Grace blinked. The question floated between them like smoke. She felt the past rush back, cold afternoons, paper bags, warm sandwiches, a tiny boy with eyes too old for his face. She nodded slowly, unsure what to say. The man's voice cracked. "You have no idea. That boy was my grandson." And just then, from the final car, another figure stepped out. A young man, tall and strong, wearing a clean white shirt and quiet determination in his stride. He walked up to her without a word, opened a small wooden box, and placed it gently in her hands. Inside, folded carefully and protected by time, was an old piece of paper, faded, crumpled at the corners, but still intact. Her handwriting, tilted and unmistakable, still read, "Today I packed you an extra milk. Eat well, sweetheart." Grace's hands trembled. Her throat closed. Her knees buckled ever so slightly. And when she looked up, the young man whispered, "I've kept that note since before I even knew how to read. You were home to me. And now I want you to own this restaurant, because it was always yours." Grace stood inside the restaurant in stunned silence, the sound around her distant and dreamlike. Applause echoing, soft music playing, hushed whispers drifting through the warm air. She had stepped out of rain and into another world, a world that, somehow, had been built on the memory of her quiet acts of kindness. The moment felt too large, too surreal, and yet all too real. Her heart raced as she looked around, her eyes drinking in the changes. The dining room was elegantly remodeled, glowing with warm lighting and soft earth tones. Smooth wood surfaces, golden accents, and framed photographs of food, people, and handwritten recipe notes adorned the walls. She recognized some of the handwriting. It was hers. She froze in place as her eyes landed on a large framed image of the old restaurant's kitchen. The one in the photo looked just like it had in her memory, with its dented pots, slightly chipped counters, and a clock that had never told the right time. Below the photo, engraved in brass, was a quote, "Kindness is the secret ingredient. Grace." She felt the breath leave her lungs. As if sensing her overwhelmed state, the young man, the boy she used to feed, now grown and well-dressed, appeared at her side. He gently took the box from her arms, his fingers brushing hers with a familiarity that transcended time. "Let me carry this," he said softly. "You've carried it long enough." Grace gave him a small, grateful nod, still too stunned to speak. Her mind was flooded with memories, and her heart struggled to balance pride with grief. There had been so many nights she had walked home from that restaurant exhausted, wondering if what she did mattered to anyone. Now that same place, reborn and radiant, stood as a shrine to her silent sacrifices. She turned to the young man beside her. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled. "Daniel," he replied. "But you never asked back then. You just gave, like it was the most natural thing in the world." Grace looked at him closely now. There was strength in his eyes, but also pain, a kind of resilience born only from hardship. She wanted to ask what had happened to him in those missing years, how he'd gone from a starving child behind a restaurant to the poised, articulate man before her. "Do you have a minute?" he asked gently, as if reading her thoughts. "There's something I want to show you." She nodded, still lost in wonder. Daniel led her through the restaurant, past tables already full of guests who paused their conversations to look at her with admiration. Some even stood as she passed, murmuring words she couldn't quite hear. "She's the one. That's her. The real Grace." Her steps were unsteady. As if walking through a dream she feared she'd wake from at any moment. They moved through a staff-only door near the back, down a quiet hallway that led to what used to be a cramped office. Now, it had been transformed into a small private gallery. The walls were covered with photographs and documents, pictures of Daniel as a child, taken by a kind neighbor or a school photographer. School report cards, most of them excellent despite their worn edges. A faded jacket. And next to it, dozens of notes. Her notes, the same ones she had written and tucked into food containers or sandwich wrappers. Some were no bigger than a receipt, others torn from the corners of her recipe book. Grace walked to them slowly, her hand hovering over the glass frames. She read them one by one. "Stay warm tonight. You matter more than you know. One day, you'll feed others too." She felt the tears well up again. Daniel stood beside her, eyes also damp. "I never told anyone," he said quietly. "Not even my grandfather, at first. I was ashamed. Not of you, never of you, but of where I came from, of needing someone to save me. I thought it made me weak." Grace looked at him then, truly saw him. Not just a well-dressed young man, but the hurt child who had stood behind a fence and waited. Every day, in sun or rain, she had found him there. He rarely spoke, just nodded and took the food with both hands like it was sacred. "But you never judged me," Daniel continued. "You never asked questions, never demanded anything. You treated me like I was human, when most people pretended I didn't exist. That made all the difference." Grace felt her throat close up again. "I didn't think it was much," she whispered. I couldn't ignore you." Daniel smiled through his tears. It was everything. A silence settled between them, heavy with meaning. Then he turned and pointed to one last display, a timeline, listing key events. When Daniel finished school, when he started working, when he opened his first business, and finally, when he bought back the very restaurant that had once been the backdrop of his survival. "You inspired all of this," he said. "When I had nothing, I still had your words. They became my map. I told my grandfather about you when I was older, and we both agreed this place had to be for you, in your name, in your spirit. It had to live on." Grace stared at the timeline. Her name was there again and again. She was part of his story, part of something so much bigger than she ever imagined. Suddenly, there was a knock on the gallery door. A young server peeked in. "Daniel, sorry to interrupt, but they're ready to serve the first meal." Daniel turned to Grace. "Would you do the honor of leading the kitchen staff tonight? We kept your old recipes. They're on the menu. We just made a few modern updates." Grace laughed, though it came out half sob, half gasp. "I haven't cooked professionally in a year. But your food," he said, "is the heart of this place." She looked at her hands, aged, worn, a bit shaky, but capable, still hers. "All right," she said with a tremble in her voice. "Let's feed them." As she stepped into the kitchen, applause erupted again. This time, it wasn't just for a name or a story. It was for a woman who had shown quiet compassion day after day and had unknowingly changed a life. And now, that life was changing hers right back. Evan's footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors of the grand event hall as he made his way toward the stage. The room was abuzz with the sounds of clinking glasses, murmured conversation, and occasional bursts of laughter. But as he climbed the final steps and turned to face the gathering, a hush settled over the audience. He adjusted the microphone, his fingers betraying the faintest tremor. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind that made you turn and run. It was something deeper, more vulnerable. It was reverence. His eyes scanned the crowd, but even as hundreds of faces stared back at him, he was searching for only one. At last he saw her, Grace, standing in the back, partially obscured behind a tall floral arrangement. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and her hands nervously wrung the strap of her old handbag. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was pinned back the same way it had always been when she worked in the kitchen. He remembered that. He remembered everything. A wave of emotion surged through Evan's chest, but he steadied himself, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "I wasn't supposed to survive," he said quietly. The microphone carried his voice effortlessly, and the room leaned in. "Statistically, kids like me, they fade into the background. They vanish. We don't become doctors. We don't run companies. We don't stand on stages like this." There were no teleprompters, no rehearsed notes, only truth. But I did survive. And the reason I'm standing here tonight is not because I was the smartest or the strongest. It was because of someone who, for a decade, gave me something more powerful than money or opportunity. She gave me kindness. Quiet, unwavering kindness. He paused. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. When I was 7, I lost my mother. What came after that was a blur. Foster care, shelters, hunger. I remember the hunger most of all. The kind that eats at your stomach. Yes, but also the kind that hollows out your spirit. I wandered the city, invisible to most, and then I met her. He looked toward the back again. Grace's eyes welled with tears. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't tell me to leave. She didn't look away. She simply fed me. Every day. Twice a day. Rain or shine. A brown paper bag. A warm sandwich. A carton of milk. And a note. He swallowed hard. A note. Always a note. His voice cracked. It might have said something as simple as, "It's cold today, stay dry." Or, "I added an egg, eat well, sweetheart." She didn't know if I could even read. But those notes, they were everything. Proof that someone somewhere saw me. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a fragile, folded piece of paper, yellow with time and creased from years of careful handling. This, he held up, was the first one I ever received. I didn't know how to read it back then, but I kept it. I kept all of them, because they reminded me I wasn't forgotten. A murmur swept through the audience, part awe, part sorrow. Several people wiped their eyes. Grace lowered her head. "Overcome." "For 10 years," Evan continued, his voice steadier now. "She fed me without asking for anything in return. No questions, no judgment. Even when people whispered behind her back, even when her manager threatened to fire her, she did it anyway, because that's who she is." He turned fully toward her now. Grace. Her name broke the air like a sunrise. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Slowly, every head turned to find her. "She's here tonight," he said, his voice full of emotion. "And I've invited all of you not just to celebrate new business, but to honor the woman who saved my life. One meal, one note, one act of love at a time." Grace tried to shrink into the shadows, but the crowd would not allow her to remain unseen. People stepped aside, parting the sea between her and the stage. Evan stepped down, his every movement deliberate and slow, until he reached her. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked into her eyes, those same soft, tired eyes that had once watched him from the kitchen doorway, and opened his arms. She hesitated, startled. Her lips trembled. She looked at him, really looked, and through the layers of adulthood she saw him. The boy with tangled hair and scuffed shoes. The boy who never spoke but always bowed his head when taking her offering. She reached out, her hand shaking, and accepted the embrace. It wasn't just a hug. It was a reunion of souls. The quiet knitting together of a bond that had never truly broken. The applause came slowly, like rain before a storm. First one, then two, and then the entire room erupted in standing ovation. Grace's knees buckled slightly, and Evan held her tighter. When the noise finally faded, he turned back to the microphone. "This restaurant we're opening today, it isn't mine. It never was. It's hers. I was just a boy outside the back door. She was a heart inside." He held out a small velvet box. Grace opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a brass key. "You own this place now," Evan said softly. It bears your name. And every child who walks through its doors will have a seat, just like I did." Grace couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the room filled with warmth and reverence. The lights above them seemed to shine a little brighter, not just because of what had been given, but because of what had been returned: dignity, recognition, and love. The restaurant shimmered with a new light that evening, not from the chandeliers overhead or the polished marble countertops, but from the atmosphere itself, thick with reverence, emotion, and memories too deep to speak aloud. Every chair was filled, yet the space didn't feel crowded. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where something sacred was happening. Conversation softened, laughter was gentler, and everyone seemed to carry an unspoken awareness that they were part of something rare. In the heart of it all stood Grace. She moved through the open kitchen like someone slowly waking from a long, quiet dream. Her hands, callous and skilled from years of chopping, stirring, and wiping away invisible tears, were steady now, more out of instinct than calm. She was anything but calm. Beneath her crisp white apron, her heart pounded like a drum. Her breath came shallow and quick, not from exhaustion, but disbelief. She hadn't set foot in this kitchen in years, and now it bore her name. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. When the invitation had arrived in the mail, formal, gold-lettered, almost too beautiful to touch, she'd assumed it was a mistake. Helen's table, it read, in bold lettering, followed by, "You're cordially invited to the grand reopening of the place you once called home." Her hands trembled as she read it, the words swimming on the page. She had held it to her chest for a long time, sitting on her small couch, surrounded by silence. She hadn't wept, but something deep in her, something long buried, had stirred. Back then, when she was let go, it hadn't been with malice, just indifference. Just a few sharp words about modernization, about being out of step with efficiency goals and digital systems. She hadn't argued. She'd merely nodded, folded her apron as though wrapping up a piece of herself, and walked away. Not one person had asked if she was okay. Not one had thanked her. She had vanished quietly from the place she gave her life to. Now she was back, and everything was different. The floors were the same, but shined anew. The walls held fresh coats of paint, but they whispered the same memories. The aromas were familiar. Onions sizzling in oil, the soft sweetness of roasted garlic, the unmistakable comfort of warm bread. But the thing that made Grace's knees weak was not what she saw, or even what she smelled. It was how people looked at her, with reverence, with respect, some even with awe. She wasn't used to being seen. For decades, she had moved through life like a background melody, essential, comforting, but unnoticed. She fed the hungry. She worked the late shifts. She remembered people's allergies and children's birthdays. But she had never been celebrated. And now, here she was, the center of a world that had once quietly dismissed her. Behind her, the young kitchen staff worked diligently. Most of them had never known her, yet they all knew of her. Daniel had made sure of that. Every one of them had been trained on her recipes, her systems, her small but powerful philosophies. Always wash your hands like you're feeding your own child. Never rush a meal just to meet a deadline. Remember that the person you're feeding might be starving for more than just food. Grace looked over at Daniel now, who was adjusting a table setting for an elderly couple. His smile was calm, effortless. His shoulders no longer curled inward with insecurity. He stood tall, confident, and kind. He had grown into a man she barely recognized, and yet he was entirely the boy she remembered, the one who used to wait outside her back door in the rain, the one who never spoke but always bowed. A soft voice stirred her from her thoughts. "Miss Grace." She turned. A young woman, no older than 25, stood holding a steaming bowl of her old potato soup. "Is this okay?" she asked. "I followed your recipe exactly, but I added a pinch of thyme instead of parsley." Grace leaned in, inhaled the aroma, and smiled. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. And it wasn't about the time. It was about the care. Then, as if on cue, the room quieted. Lights dimmed slightly, and Daniel stepped forward to the center of the room. He held a microphone, but didn't need it. When he began to speak, It was as though the room leaned in to listen. "Tonight," he said, "is more than a reopening. It's a homecoming." He paused, eyes scanning the room. Then he turned toward the kitchen. "This place exists because of one woman. You all know her name now. You see it on the sign. But years ago, she was just someone who showed up every day. She never asked for recognition. She never even told anyone what she was doing. But she saved my life." Gasps and murmurs rose softly through the crowd. I was a homeless child, lost, alone, and every single day, she left a meal for me behind the restaurant. She didn't know my name. She didn't ask for anything. She just gave. And I ate those meals like they were treasure. He held up a small, tattered scrap of paper. This was the first note she ever wrote me. "Eat well, sweetheart. Don't be afraid." I carried it in my pocket until it disintegrated, but I never forgot the handwriting or the warmth. He turned to Grace now, his voice breaking. "You gave me a reason to believe. And now I want the world to see the woman who showed me that kindness is the greatest strength of all." There was a silence, so full it felt like the room had stopped breathing. Then someone began to clap, then another, and then the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous applause. Grace didn't move at first. She stood frozen, her hand over her heart, her eyes wide with emotion. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, not because she wanted attention, but because she understood this wasn't about her anymore. It was about what she represented: hope, kindness, endurance. As she reached Daniel, he stepped aside, and a young girl ran up to her, arms full of flowers. "Are you the lady who feeds people for free?" she asked. Grace knelt down, smiled, and nodded. "I try to be." The girl handed her the bouquet, then hugged her with childlike certainty. Grace held her tightly, eyes closed. In that moment, she knew something deeper than success or recognition. She knew she had made a difference, and that, quietly, without fanfare, was all she ever wanted. From the moment Grace stepped into the restaurant now bearing her name, something inside her began to stir, a sensation both foreign and long forgotten, as though a dormant part of her had been awakened by sunlight after years spent in the shadows. The scent of simmering herbs, warm bread, and citrus oil clung to the air, but it wasn't the food alone that gave the place its soul. It was the people. The way their eyes followed her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with reverence. In the days following the grand reopening, Grace found herself wrapped in a gentle whirlwind of activity. Journalists requested interviews, community members brought flowers, and children from the local shelter dropped off crayon drawings of her, always including a brown paper bag in her hand. But she didn't crave the attention. In fact, she quietly avoided it when she could. She preferred the solace of the prep kitchen, where the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board and the steam curling from pots soothed her. It was here, in the quiet bustle of making something from nothing, that she felt most like herself. Every morning, Grace arrived early, before even the newest staff. She would unlock the back door, just as she had for a decade, and stand for a moment in the stillness. Sometimes, she swore she could still feel the presence of that quiet little boy who used to wait behind the dumpster. Though the spot was now paved, lit, and cleaned regularly, she still looked for him in the shadows. Old habits don't vanish easily. She kept a small notebook in her apron, filled with recipes passed down from her mother, along with new ones she developed over the years. It was battered and stained, the pages curling at the corners, but she treated it like scripture. Each page held not just instructions, but memories of cold winters warmed by chicken stew, of quiet nights soothed by cinnamon rice, of hands trembling with exhaustion, but still finding strength to stir a pot. As Grace returned to the kitchen, she was no longer a forgotten cog in a machine. She was its heart, yet she never issued commands. Instead, she asked questions. How was your night? Do you need help with the soup base? Did you eat today? Her authority came not from title, but from kindness. New hires learned quickly that in this kitchen, compassion was not a luxury. It was the main ingredient. Daniel, ever gentle and watchful, urged her to rest more. You don't have to work so hard anymore, Grace. You've done more than enough. But she would just smile and gently shake her head. This isn't work, she'd say. This is who I am. Customers noticed. They spoke in hushed voices about the woman who used to feed a homeless child for 10 years and now stood humbly behind the counter, checking the salt in the soup with the same care one might show a newborn. They didn't just come for the meals anymore. They came for the meaning. They came to be reminded that humanity still had quiet heroes. One afternoon, a young woman entered the restaurant alone, holding the hand of a small boy. She approached the counter nervously and asked to speak with Grace. When Grace emerged, wiping her hands on a towel, the woman's voice trembled. "When I was 16, she said, you left a paper bag by the back door for me too. Just once. But it was the night I had nowhere to go. And in the bag was a sandwich, a thermos of soup, and a note that said, 'Stay warm tonight. You're stronger than the storm.'" I read that note over and over until I believed it. Her voice cracked. "This is my son. I wanted him to meet you." Grace knelt down and smiled at the boy. "Do you like soup?" she asked. He nodded shyly. "Good," she said. "We make the best in the world here, and you're always welcome." Moments like these became more frequent. Each one etched into Grace's soul, like a quiet anthem of redemption. She never boasted. She never sought credit. But each grateful face was a page in the story she'd written without ever picking up a pen. As word spread, donations poured in. Local businesses offered free produce. Farmers delivered eggs and milk, and volunteers appeared daily, eager to help prepare meals for the shelter kids, the elderly, and anyone who knocked on the kitchen's back door. No one was turned away. If a hand reached out, it was met with a full plate and a warm smile. Grace used the restaurant's profits not for luxury, but for expansion. She opened a second kitchen, smaller, simpler, designed only for preparing free meals. Many of the staff were former homeless youth, given a second chance not just to work, but to belong. Despite all this, Grace kept none of the glory. When asked how she felt about having a restaurant named after her, she would simply say, "It's not about my name. It's about making sure no child waits in the cold like Evan did." Daniel, now a steady partner in every sense of the word, often watched her with quiet awe. One evening, as they closed the restaurant together, he turned to her and said, "You've changed more lives than you'll ever know." Grace looked up at the stars peeking through the night sky. "I didn't mean to change anything," she said. "I just didn't want anyone to feel forgotten." Her voice was soft but firm. There was no trace of bitterness about the years she had spent overlooked. Instead, there was peace, a kind of peace that comes only from knowing you lived your truth, even when no one was watching. And as the final chairs were lifted onto tables and the kitchen lights dimmed, Grace walked to the back of the restaurant. She opened the door, placed a brown paper bag on the old step, and paused, just in case. Grace never asked for anything in return. And yet, she received something priceless: genuine gratitude, love, and a legacy that touched countless lives. Her story reminds us that kindness doesn't need to be seen to be powerful. It just needs to exist. If you believe that compassion can change the world, share this story. Because maybe your small act today could become someone else's miracle tomorrow.